Statistics show that over 80% of people have been through some kind of trauma globally. Yeah. So none of us will ever be able to really escape trauma. Once you've lived a life, you've gone through trauma. And that informs how we perform at work. It informs how we show up at work. And even as a leader, it informs how you lead.
Hi, friends.
Hey, Mel. Hey, Deborah. What's going on?
I'm having the time of my life talking to the both of you right now, so really
excited. Get that a lot. We get that a lot.
Same. Listener friends, with us today is Debra Lee. She is the founder of Creaturae, and they specialize in creating mindful and trauma-informed workplaces. And we are super excited to learn from Debra today all about embodied leadership and trauma-informed workplace leadership. So, Debra, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Mel. I'm really excited to be talking with the both of you today. Happy to share in any way that I can.
Let's dive right in. We would love to hear a little more about your personal journey here. How did you get into trauma-informed care and a focus on embodied leadership?
Yeah, just to share my personal journey, I walked out of an abusive relationship in 2021. And when I went to the various institutions that you would normally expect to get support and help, like law enforcement, hospital, even church institutions, I just found that people weren't really understanding the gravity of the situation or dealing with it with the urgency that was required. And oftentimes I felt like there were real gaps that weren't met, and issues around like justice and support, and people were really understanding what was at stake. And even then, the main people that I got help from ultimately were people who had a lot of experience in the area of trauma. For example, a social worker who has witnessed a lot of these sorts of cases of domestic violence, and she could actually break down to me what were some of the processes involved. And then when I understood a lot of these dynamics were about power and about control, that's when my eyes were open and I was able to have a really clearer picture of how to move forward with my life. And then in the process of it, I could use that lens, understand why people related to other people a certain way. For example, in a conversation, why people might just, for example, not even address the questions that's raised, or move on to another subject, or be dismissive, or use jokes or sarcasm to deflect. And I did a lot of research around emotional abuse. I did a lot of research around trauma. And one of the books that really changed my life was the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, who is a psychiatrist who has been on the forefront of trauma for over 30 years. He's treated all sorts of patients with any number of mental health issues, from bipolar disorder to borderline personality disorder and major depressive episodes. And one of the things that really left a very deep impression on me is that a lot of the common core roots of all of these mental health disorders is the fact that all of them had what you call complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is a bit different from the classic PTSD, as you know, like maybe you get into an accident and then you lose a limb and then your life is forever changed. CPTSD is something that arises within relationship. And in these relationships where there's an imbalance of power, there's often abuse or emotional neglect. And a lot of this starts in your early childhood, and it's shaped by your caregivers and how you relate to them, the coping mechanisms you developed as a child to be able to survive in an environment that maybe was abusive or was emotionally neglectful. And this has an impact on how you relate to others in life and your attachment styles later on as an adult. And even the choices that you make, neuroscience has shown that it actually has a real and felt impact on your brain functioning. So you can think about how that affects the prefrontal cortex, how a person makes decisions, and even things like who they get attached to, how they find a life partner, for example. And so reading this book really helped me understand myself, my own life trajectory. And it also helped me understand what it means to be cut off from a sense of embodied living what it means to be cut off from the messages that your body is signaling to you. Because it's so easy to intellectualize and just live up here, when as a child, you were filled with anxiety and anguish, right? In an environment that was unstable or chaotic.
Yeah.
And nobody was there to address it for you. Nobody was there to help you make sense of it, so you learn to cut it off. And this is what Bessel van der Kolk talks about in his book. They get survivors of complex post-traumatic stress disorder get so used to these unremitting signals of anxiety and distress from a very young age. And because they don't have any other option, they can't pick and choose their caregivers or pluck themselves out of an environment that is destructive or filled with chaos and abuse. They don't get that choice, right? So what they have to do at the end of the day is learn to dissociate.
Mm-hmm.
And so you develop those coping mechanisms, and it's very helpful for when you're a kid and you just need to survive. But as an adult, it could mean that you become like dismissive, cut off, not in touch with your feelings, emotionally tone deaf to yourself. And even in your relationships at work or even within intimate relationships, you develop trauma-based responses. And you might be familiar with fight, flight, freeze. And then there's also fawn, right? That's another one. And then the two that are like more emergent, discovered by the National Institute for Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine, expounds upon, is attach, cry for help. And then the final one is collapse and submit. So a lot of these ways that people behave, if you really trace it back over time and look at the trauma map, it's rooted a lot in unresolved things that happened in that past. And the key thing to note is that even though you may have gone through a lot of abuse when you're a kid, and you could still be very high functioning, you could still really perform in life. But what might happen to you at one point is that something happens. There are a few things that could happen to you, something life-changing, or you have a trigger, and then suddenly you start to unravel. And then that's when people are forced in many ways to confront their own trauma, to confront their own unresolved issues from the past. And so that brought me to a space of wanting to, first of all, my experience as an abuse survivor and going through the various institutions and seeing the gaps there, that's what got me asking questions. And then when I understood the mind-body connection, when I read The Body Keeps the Score, is when I really realized, hey, this is a very valuable roadmap for others to have, not just to support other people, but even to understand their own selves. Because I think the tendency for a lot of people is just to end up finding fault with themselves and like blaming themselves and beating themselves up, which, it's not very helpful. And at the end of the day, until you can extend a kindness to yourself, it's actually very hard to extend that same kindness to other people in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I'm really sorry that you experienced something like that. What inspired you, I guess, to take what you learned about yourself and that understanding and bring that into the workplace?
I think once you go through something like that, you can't unsee it. Things through a very different lens, and then you understand power dynamics in a way. There's a before and after. When you are in a position where you have been traumatized by an intimate partner, and then you see how the systems reinforce injustice around it and how the truth gets completely obfuscated at times, you realize, once you see it. I started to see things in a way that maybe a lot of people miss. And then you see this playing out at workplaces, and then you understand, whoa, hostile, and you would not expect that, even in a corporate setting. And I just realized that whatever you're not dealing with in your personal life, it will spill out into your work life. As much as you might try to like put your mask up, it finds its way to seep out. And I realized that at the end of the day, what people seek at work is still human connection. And that is what creates more productive workplaces. I hesitate to use that word productive because I don't want people to just focus on that as the bottom line. But at the end of the day, like when there's a culture of collaboration, when there's a culture of trust and safety, psychological safety, and when people are able to feel free to bring their whole selves to work, once those foundations are set in place, it actually creates a much, much healthier workplace where people actually look forward to going to work, because you're not going to work to be a machine, you're going to work because you want to feel a sense of meaning, enjoyment in what you do, and connection with other people on your team. And so a trauma-informed workplace will equip you to be able to have those key fundamentals and to be able to connect with your coworkers in a way that's meaningful and enjoyable.
Yeah, we talk about that all the time.
I feel like we have this really old archetype of power. Because to your point, a lot of abusive relationships, the dynamic is about power. And the way we leverage power, the way we embody power at work, the archetype of the leader as control and command. And I know obviously we have a lot more definitions of leadership now. I get that. But the way organizations are structured, the ways of working around organizations, and quite honestly, even what we promote in organizations around people that come across as confident, strong by any means necessarily, like those things still are incented. And so it's an interesting discussion on power, because I feel like there's still very much an old archetype of power living, breathing foundationally in corporate America. It's evolving. It's not every place. I get it, but it's still pretty old school.
Yeah, I think it's hard to run away from that. I think in all human relations, even if you look at animals, there's always some kind of hierarchy. You look at apes, chimpanzees, you see how the hierarchy, it's almost intrinsic. My company is called Creaturae, by the way. So it's I named it Creaturae because I wanted to capture the nuances around how people are. Like, we're social animals and in some ways conditioned to behave like that. It's like survival of the fittest. But then also the social element means that as humans, as a more highly evolved species, we look for something more than just that kind of old school power structure that animals have. We look for connection, we look for authenticity, we look for meaning and purpose. And that's what differentiates us from a chimp, right?
Yeah.
The chimp just interested only in where its next meal is coming from or who it's going to mate with. But as human beings, there's something deeper than that. And I think that's where we're talking about a trauma-informed workplace, where we understand that we're not just here to work, but we're also here because we're seeking like ways of relating to each other that is effective for the work, but it also is meaningful for us as human beings.
Yeah. How did your experiences really shape your understanding of leadership in the workplace? The power dynamics that we're going through, what made you focus in the leadership space specifically?
When I started doing a lot of research around abuses, around organizational culture, around workplace bullying, around just even gaslighting and psychopathic behavior, that's when I realized, hey, there needs to be, number one, a very clear understanding of trauma, what it is, trauma-informed care, as well as like policies and guidelines as to how to support people, number one, who've been through that within the workplace, because statistics show that over 80% of people have been through some kind of trauma globally. Yeah. So none of us will ever be able to really escape trauma. Once you've lived a life, you've gone through trauma. And that informs how we perform at work. It informs how we show up at work. And even as a leader, it informs how you lead. So if you went through all these things yourself and you're like, I earned my stripes this way, and you never work through how in some ways it shaped and maybe even traumatized you, then you're going to be like, I'm going to inflict that on other people. You may not consciously think that, but that's what you're going to act out, right? Until and unless you work through your own stuff, or if you gain the awareness around what trauma-informed care is, what trauma is, maybe drawn out your own trauma map and understand the mind-body connection, practice good self-care, it's really hard for you to show up as a leader. That is not coercive, especially if that's how you were groomed into becoming a leader.
Yeah. I am a huge proponent of therapy. Therapy is good for everyone, especially when you hear statistics like 80% of people globally have experienced some level of trauma. And there's always, I know this seems like a cliche quote that gets passed around all the time, but it's like being aware of everyone's going through something. But there's real impact there, because I think to your point, when you're in psychologically unsafe environments in the workplace, you're consistently being re-traumatized.
And the real danger is not being able to identify it.
Yeah.
Like when you're so stuck in it, it's hard for you to even see it. And then you might even start blaming yourself or internalizing it. One of the key ways that even in the legal profession, right, like how they train a lot of these young, bright-eyed lawyers is inculcate into them a sense of you're never good enough. But they don't tell you that straight out, but they set the bar like here, and then when you reach it for it, it's a sense that keeps getting reinforced, and then it's almost like brainwashing.
The goalposts constantly move, and then they're always questioning their abilities. Like you see that in so many different work environments, and it's almost like an emotional abuse that happens over and over. We hear it often. Francesca, you and I just covered some headlines recently where it was talking about there's that right to disconnect law that's been passed in some global locations, but the US is considering it, or they're at least watching it very closely, because people have said it's like a badge of honor to be in burnout to get to where they are. But it's those environments that continue to perpetuate this. You're not good enough. You need to work harder. You need to work 80-hour weeks to succeed. It's just not sustainable. Yeah.
And we're seeing it with the well-being numbers. We've been following well-being numbers for a while. Well-being just keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. There's a lot of factors to that. But to your very good point, Deborah, if you have leaders that don't understand how to not re-traumatize people constantly, like it's not going to get any better. There's no safety net. Yeah.
And how do they not re-traumatize people unless they themselves, on some level, have worked through their own trauma?
Yeah. Gotta do the work.
Can you explain what embodied leadership means in simple terms? Explain it to us like we're 5. What are the characteristics of an embodied leader?
So basically, an embodied leader is somebody who is aware of the mind-body connection and has done the work and gotten the psychoeducation around that, who takes care of himself and shows up at work with presence and authenticity. I don't know if that's simple enough for a 5-year-old, maybe a very smart 5-year-old.
It's one of my favorite subreddits. Explain to me like I'm 5. I just think, okay, if you can do that, it's the great way to say it. That was great.
I really highly recommend, if you're a leader, to do the work, because you're going to have so much impact on the teams that you lead, the clients that you meet, and just everybody that comes into your sphere.
There's a statistic that the person that has the most impact on your mental health is most likely not your spouse, it's your manager.
Yes. And I have seen that. Your boss has the biggest impact on your mental health. And it is absolutely true. I can tell you from a personal experience that that's definitely true. And it really shapes the way that you show up at work. It really shapes your values even, because at the end of the day, a lot of us just want to do a good job, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of us want to show up in the best way that we can with good work ethic. We want to please our bosses, right?
Yeah.
If their values are like very different from yours, if their style of leadership is coercive, your psyche is going to take a beating.
Think about the statement that's commonplace that is really sad is in even the memes and jokes. You see it all the time, like memes and jokes about, oh, I've got the Sunday scaries. I'm ready for the day when that doesn't exist anymore for people in the workplace.
The thing that makes me really nervous when leaders haven't done the work, to your great point, when they don't operate with trauma-informed care, these people have your livelihood on the line, because their evaluation of your performance, of how you show up, is directly tied to your salary, your benefits sometimes. And so it can feel there's so much at stake on this one person and on this one relationship. And if that's not trauma-informed, or if that person's not handling that with care, woof. So what is trauma-informed care? This is like, when we, especially as a manager, what is it?
Trauma-informed care is basically understanding that most of us have some kind of trauma. And understanding that sometimes, especially when we're in a situation where there's a lot of stress or there are triggers involved, that we might act out our trauma. So what does that mean? It means that you might respond in any one of those 6 ways that I mentioned earlier. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, attach, cry for help, collapse, and submit. The ones that all of us know are fight, flight, freeze. Yeah, and I think that as human beings on a very kind of day-to-day basis, relational level, we recognize that. We can intuit at times, like without maybe on a non-verbal basis, like when somebody is in freeze.
Yeah.
Maybe over a phone call when somebody's just completely silent, you're like, hello, like, are you there? Is everything okay? So that you can't see if there's that element where the non-verbal affect is not there. So trauma-informed care just basically provides you a framework for relating to people in a way where you don't immediately start associating behavior with character or what's wrong with you, so to speak, as to what happened to you, right? So it's not saying that we need to know your entire life history or we need to know intimate details, but we want to know in the present what's triggering you, what is making it hard for you to show up fully, for example, to just be present or to ask questions that show that you're engaged and leaning into the work. So if somebody's not doing that, instead of just saying, oh, she's lazy, or like she's not good enough for this role, or she's being passive aggressive, or whatever story you want to attach to their behavior, go beyond that. Dig a little deeper. Create some level of psychological safety and connection and vulnerability, right? Show up as a leader, your team. If you can show some degree of vulnerability, your team is going to respond to that. And just now you mentioned like the old school way of leadership, right? So people in many ways led to believe that you cannot show vulnerability as a leader, but studies have shown that what promotes connection, what promotes a sense of workplace well-being is when leaders are able to have good boundaries, but at the same time, have some vulnerability so that you're not just that strong leader who has everything in place and who uses coercive means to get everybody into action, but you're showing up as a real authentic person. And that's what people connect with. That's what people resonate with. That's what people relate to.
Yeah. One of the things I think about a lot is just being genuinely interested in what your team is about, what motivates them, to your very good point. What does their life look like? Again, you don't need their whole history, but maybe you need to know they're a single mom or they're caring for a parent with Alzheimer's or they're neurodivergent, whatever it is. Genuinely being curious, not as, to your point, not assuming that if they're acting a certain way that they're bad, but maybe something else is going on, and then digging deeper. I love that idea.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fight or flight, the freeze. I think we know what those are, right? Those are the ones we already know. But I'm curious about fawn, collapse and submit, and it's attach cry,
attach
right?
Cry for help. Yeah.
What does fawn look like? Because when I hear that, I'm like doing this. I'm like preening myself. Or I see that sometimes where you see people like playing with their hair constantly in meeting. Is that, what do those three look like? Because I don't know if I know.
That's funny. I love that you shared about that. I can see why you would think that. So basically fawn is, as its name suggests, it's like fawning behavior. It sounds a bit playful, but essentially fawning means you are in some ways overextending your boundaries and pushing yourself into the background to accommodate somebody else. Like you're trying to win somebody's favor. A little bit different from fight, flight, freeze, because that's mediated more by the amygdala, which is this emotional center in your brain. And that's very visceral. It's a very visceral reaction. But fawn is actually more mediated by the prefrontal cortex. So there's a lot of even strategy that goes into it. I love that you brought that up about the hair, because over the centuries, it's been shown that women, because of, in many ways, our weaker stature physically, I'm talking about physically, just we have less muscle mass than men. And so we've had to find ways to protect ourselves. And so then that's what a lot of women have over the centuries used fawning as a strategy to cope within a very patriarchal system. Not to say that men don't do it too, because men do it. Is that there's usually an imbalance of power when people fawn, right? Because a lot of bosses respond to that.
Oh yeah, because it can feel good, right? You're coming over to their side. What about collapse and submit? What is that?
So collapse and submit is when you basically just fold over every single time, right? Like anytime anybody says anything, there's no pushback, there's no accountability, there's no kind of like negotiation, there are no hard conversations. It's just, okay, sure. It's a bit different from fawn, right? So fawn is a little bit more like, there's some strategy to it where you're thinking actively. What is this person like? You're anticipating his needs. Like you're planning almost your moves like 5 steps ahead. There's a lot of thinking that goes into it where you're like, and also intuiting, the other person's needs ahead of yours. right? But collapse and submit is just basically, if you can think of folding, you just keep folding in a card game, for example. You don't play your cards, you just fold. Yeah,
It's
so it's
doormat.
like,
That sounds exhausting.
yeah, it's like you've given up. You've given
Mhm.
up, basically. You've basically given up. So that is collapse and submit. And then
Yeah,
the
then
final
attach
one,
cry. Yeah.
yeah, attach cry for help. So that if you can think of a baby and how babies are like so vulnerable, and because of their neediness and the helplessness, they engender like extra care and protection from from caregivers that actually take the job seriously. Obviously, if it gets to a point where there's too much of that, it can cause burnout in a relationship, right? And it can damage the relationship in the person that is defaulting to that trauma response. It can lead to them losing a sense of self as well. Because what happens is learned helplessness, right? So instead of being able to have the presence of mind to give yourself space to come back to yourself and then think through the problem and then think about how you're going to engage people, what resources you need, who you're going to ask for help for, to think about it in like a calm and like maybe more pragmatic way. But if your default is just to attach to somebody and cry to them for help, then you develop a pattern of learned helplessness over time. And this can even be within intimate relationships. It can be within professional relationships, right? Where one person's always like more than happy to help, more than happy to be the voice of reason, more than happy to be the savior, so to speak, right? And then the other person is, oh, I need your help. And there's nothing wrong with asking for help. I just want to underline that. But if it's become to the point where it's learned helplessness, then that's when you're talking more about this trauma response of attached cry for help.
I had someone in my life that their father was massively abusive throughout their entire life. And their trauma response was absolutely freeze. Anytime there was massive conflict, just freeze, literally physically, vocally. It was like,
yeah.
I'm curious if that was always going to be their trauma response, no matter what. So if you have your trauma response is like the one you always go to, or do people have different trauma responses for different situations?
Yeah, so you can actually have more than one type of default trauma response. I do have a boundaries PDF, like an embodied and boundaries PDF to give away that people can access through a link. If they sign up, they can get it delivered into the inbox. I actually, in that PDF, elaborate more on the symptoms of each bucket of trauma responses. And to your question about your friend who tended to default to freeze, she might actually have other trauma responses as well, but maybe it just didn't manifest in those times that you were with her. In her family, it might have been a lot more adaptive for her to just freeze up. And so that might have been her default. But all that to say is that a lot of it is just conditioning and how we learn to adapt in an environment, right? A lot of it is survival. What trauma response works best for that specific environment? In very combative environments, fight is going to be the trauma response that comes out, where you're very reactive, you're very quick to hit back hard, you're very vocal. So that's your developed trauma response. But also consider that the role that you play within the family of origin affects how you cope with conflict, right? So it's like in families, there are sometimes what you call the black sheep or the peacemaker, or the golden child, and all of these categories, and these are just frameworks for thinking about your trauma response, can shape the various tools that you lean on in order to survive, the way that your nervous system adapts and adjusts to survive in that kind of environment.
We know that this is how people might react, and they might react in multiple situations. We also know that, to your very good point, 80% of people have some sort of trauma response that they're coming to the workplace with. What do managers need to look out for when we're looking at trauma in terms of the signs here? What should they be looking out for to be more of an embodied leader or have that trauma response?
So one of the things that you want to look out for is like startle reflexes. So let's say if you like come up to your employee and then he or she's like very jumpy and like they're like that, right? Or like they look checked out, or they're not performing up to the usual standard, they've lost a spark. These are all indicators that they're not their usual selves, right? You hired them for a reason. Hopefully you had a face-to-face interview at least, and then that's the persona they presented. Yes, I agree. You get to know them better over time. But at the same time, there's a baseline self that they bring to work. And if they are moving beyond or away from that and not performing up to standard, they're not showing up in the way that you expect, and you're asking questions, it's important to engage your employee. It's important to make time for them. It's important to make them feel safe enough to approach you with their concerns, because they don't have all the answers. There might be other employees in the workplace that's bullying them or making it hard for them to get the job done. Are you, as a boss, creating enough psychological safety as to where they feel like they can confide in you without being branded as a troublemaker? And sometimes, as a boss, you also have to be a bit more of a coach in that sense, to coach them up to that standard and tell them very clearly, this is what I expect from you. Let me know if there are things that you need my help on, or if you just have questions or the issues that you're dealing with that I can advocate for you in any way. I would. Your employee just needs to know that you have their back. You're not going to throw them under the bus. That is one of the key things that the employees want to feel.
Sometimes it feels, as a leader and as a manager, it can feel so complex what you need to do to manage teams, and you need to be this perfect person. But at the end of the day, it sounds like what they really need is to feel safe.
Yeah, psychological safety is key. And then obviously from there, we can branch it out to how do you create that psychological safety, right? So we talk about emotional intelligence, and then this brings up somatic intelligence as well, where if you've done the work and if you're self-aware, there's a mind-body connection. So then you're more aware of how you show up. You're more aware of, okay, when I'm communicating, how do I look? Right? Because like 70% of our communication is nonverbal. So I could be saying all this stuff, but if I look a certain way, people are like, ooh, not sure if I'm going to reach out to her. So a lot of things are contingent on you being, as a leader, aware of the mind-body connection, aware of what self-care looks like, aware of good boundaries, and how to lead with a style of leadership that engenders that sense of psychological safety. And part of that is also understanding that every employee is different. There's no cut and paste formula. Like communication styles, like some people need a more like directive, simple, succinct, and clear way of communicating. And then some people might respond to a more relational way of communicating. And I'm not saying that you have to be like this magician to read and intuit all these things. But the interesting thing is that once you are able to be more connected within yourself on an intuitive level, you'll find that the connection on an individual basis is something that flows naturally.
Yeah, honestly, just be interested in your employees, figure this stuff out, have the trust in their relationship. Anybody that's ever worked for me, I am absolutely not the perfect person. But one of the things I always hope people feel is that sense of trust and safety. And I think if you engender that with people genuinely, and you genuinely care for people, you can biff so hard on stuff and they will forgive you for it, because they know ultimately the important stuff you did.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, just because you biff on people, it doesn't mean that's bad. In fact, because people appreciate honest feedback, and people know that they're not perfect. Nobody wants to just be recognized for this one side of who they are. Like, that's like saccharine. Like, we don't want that. Like, we're whole people and we all have nice and nasty sides. So when somebody can embrace that in us and call it out even, or try to hold us accountable, we actually feel loved. On a very deep level, there's a sense of being known and seen and accepted. So that's something that I don't think that as leaders we should shy away from.
I'd love to talk about who's getting this right. There are workplaces who are focusing on this. In your experience, what are some examples of companies that are excelling in trauma-informed care and embodied leadership?
They may not use the words trauma-informed care or even embodied leadership. There are definitely companies that do lead with a focus on mental wellness, and they do promote psychological safety and an environment where you can be open. They promote mental health days off, where you just take a day to disconnect because you need it for your mental health. They provide employee assistance programs, which are comprehensive and trauma-informed sometimes, like they're trauma-informed interventions. So the companies that immediately come to mind are definitely Google and then also Salesforce. And then Mel, this is where we met, which is that
Culture
And
First.
I just love Culture First. This is not a plug for them, but I'm just sharing from my perspective that when I show up there, it's always welcoming. People are always sensitive, and it just creates an environment where real relationships can be formed, where it's not about, oh, let's just put up a work front in. It's not about just discussions and transactional relationships. It's about actual relationship. And that's where real mental wellness comes. Like you're talking about, let's say if you have a trauma history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all you knew in the past was like abuse or like emotional neglect and so on and so forth, right? What can change that? Being in an environment like Culture First, for example.
Yeah.
Where people show up authentically, where you feel welcome, you feel met, and you feel like there's potential like for deeper relationships. And yeah, so these are some of the companies that come to mind when you talk about trauma-informed and psychologically safe workplaces.
I love again, not a formal plug for Culture First, but yes, that's where we met and they're awesome. And a good example of that is so funny in this Slack group that we're a part of with that group is it's an excellent community for anyone who's interested in joining. And I have not been active in Slack for a few weeks because of another project. And someone from Culture First reached out to see if I was okay, which was super nice. Yeah. I'm like, there's a ton of people in here, but okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like it's the little extra step, right? Just as an example of something like that.
And that's how I just wanted to add to that, Mel, because it brought up something. So Bessel van der Kolk actually said is one of his most famous quotes is like, trauma is not being seen, heard, or felt, right? Obviously, we have many different types of definitions, but that's, to me, one of the most succinct ways to express what it feels like to live in an environment where there's ongoing trauma. You just never acknowledged. Your emotional needs are never met. And it's you're not seen, you're not heard, you're not felt. And in our generation, children were literally meant to be seen and not heard, brought up that way. And there's a certain amount of like emotional neglect and trauma that comes with that, where you're not given the tools to process certain things that happen to you. And so even that little gesture where somebody from Culture First reached out to you and said, hey, just check in with you, are you okay? It's acknowledging.
Yeah.
That, hey, I just want to know if you're okay, like what's going on, and that they see you, they noticed you, and that speaks volumes. It's a small gesture, but it speaks volumes.
100%. And then to your statement, I'm like, wait, is all of Gen X and millennials, are we just all 100% traumatized to be seen and not heard?
It's the woke generation. It's like when you're woke, you're just, you're going to say stuff. You're going to 100%. Say stuff.
So our generation's working to break the cycle, right?
Yeah.
What role, obviously, Francesca and I both come from talent development backgrounds and leadership development. What role does continuous education and training play in building and sustaining trauma-informed workplaces?
In the realm of continuous education and training, one of the key things that I can think about is raising awareness around what trauma-informed care is, what trauma is, creating that language speak around it, right? So that people are able to bring that into work and be more cognizant of it. Even when I talk about somatics, a lot of people don't know what that is. When you're able to bring that into the working vocabulary and help people understand, hey, I'm having back pain here. A lot of our physical ailments are not just isolated. A lot of them are rooted in relational issues that were never resolved, or like psychological issues that come about as a result of things that are happening within relationship, or things that happen to you that you never were able to process. Just to give you a little picture, for example, in my own personal life, like I struggled with depression throughout my marriage. I struggled with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, for the entirety of my marriage. And I also struggled with insomnia throughout my marriage, like for 10 years. And I tried many times to do whatever I could to get out of all these things and to deal with it. Within 3 months of walking out of that destructive marriage, all of it just went away naturally. I tried so hard to get off antidepressants, for 10 years, and I couldn't. So that, I think, speaks volumes about the impact that all of these unresolved issues relationally or unprocessed emotions and traumas has on the body. Mm-hmm. Why I totally believe the body does keep the score, right?
Yeah.
It's sending you messages. And when you're able to develop within the workplace a shared understanding of what, for example, something like somatics is, what, for example, body sensations are. Like when you feel like a pain here, what is it? Left in your left chest, that's heartbreak oftentimes. Or when you feel a lump here in your throat, what's that? It could be that maybe you're feeling sad, or that there's stuff that you want to say that you've held back for so long. You've had to silence yourself, and that accumulates here. There's a pain that comes up. So once people are more cognizant of, hey, your body is sending you messages, it's not just all in your head. There's an actual real and felt impact of these occurrences within relationship or within your life, traumatic experiences you've been through that accumulate within the body. Once you're able to create a shared understanding and create more awareness around how these things can be managed or dealt with, or how people can be supported through these things, through these traumas, then it creates a more open and compassionate workplace where people don't feel like they have to wear masks all the time in order to survive. But they can actually be open, and they can actually ask for help and be vulnerable, and people can show up for each other, where you can even be silly, like talking about Slack. I wrote in my other life, I'm a mermaid. And I was just being playful at that time. My second singer-songwriter album, I shared earlier, I'm a musician too. It's called Mermaid, and it documents my journey out of that relationship. I did a lot of healing through just composing music, writing out my thoughts into lyric. And so the mermaid symbolizes freedom, it symbolizes depth, breaking free. And so then I just wrote that, and then somebody responded, and she was like, hey, you should check out the Mermaid Festival.
Yes, it's so fun. I've been in it twice. I did the parade.
Wait, okay.
I will send you pictures after this recording.
Francesca, I was like, what? Which world
I've been in the Mermaid Parade twice. When I lived in New York City, annually, I used to go with my friends, and we were in the Mermaid Parade.
Yes, and it's so fun. I haven't gone for it yet because I think it had recently just passed by, and I was still in New Jersey at the time. But I'm just gonna definitely attend it next year, and it's just fun. It's nice that people acknowledge these little quirks and little bits for attention in some ways. So it's like people respond to that, and you feel connected.
Yeah, it's a fun little community. It truly, with the body keeping the score. I remember I once left a really toxic work environment, and within the first week, the first thing I did is I booked a deep tissue massage. First of all, I felt like I just had lumps on my shoulders, and the woman was like, oh my God, is this hurting you? I was like, yes, in the best way possible. Get it out of here. And then I took the hardest sleep it felt like 48 hours. Everything was releasing, and within 3 months, I did not have any of that pain, the body pain. So it's just so relatable, how it really does show up for you.
Question for both of you, and it might, I tend to like to simplify things, distill them down and really be simple, but I'm wondering if, and I've never thought about it this way, but does all this come down to, as a person, as a leader, like you need to be felt, seen, and heard yourself? What does that look like for you? Have you done the work to do that? And then be able to feel, see, and hear the people around you. Does it all come down to do it for yourself and then do it for other people?
Yeah, so that's a really great point that you raised, Francesca, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you can't give to others what you don't give to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can fake it a little bit, but I don't think you really can.
Yeah,
to your point.
It builds up after a while. If all you're doing is putting up a mask, and you're just gonna be rolling around in resentment, and you're gonna feel like burnt out, and you're gonna be pissed when that. You can try to hide that, but it's just gonna seep out, and it's gonna be experienced on a felt level.
What should leaders know? What's one step, if they do nothing else, that someone can take tomorrow to start to really practice this embodied leadership and start to build more trauma awareness within the workplace? What's one thing that they can implement?
I definitely think that the first thing that I would start with is reflection. And I know that might be a little bit off-center for the fact that we've been talking about trauma-informed care all the while, but giving yourself that space to reflect, it actually helps you to come back to your body.
Yeah.
It helps in some ways your body to catch up with your mind, or vice versa as well, because sometimes the body often knows things ahead of time, and then it takes a while for the mind to register it. So when you give yourself space and time to reflect, maybe you take the time off, go on a trip, something that's not agenda based, right? where you give yourself that space and time to reflect. And then you'll be able to think maybe, oh, how have I been responding in this situation? Are there certain patterns in a way that I relate? And then from there, you can think about what you want for your team or what you want for yourself as a leader. And then look at the various options available to you. Oh, should I talk to my boss, for example? Should I engage a therapist or a coach? Or should I call up a good friend or read a book? Like all these things, there are a multitude of ways to be an effective leader, to be more trauma informed. But if it's just another thing on a list of things to do, you're not going to show up with presence and authenticity. You're going to be like, let's just get it done now. And it's not going to be authentic. It's not going to come from a place of being fed. So give yourself that space and the time to reflect on where you are, who you are, and where you want to go.
Reflection, I feel like it's such a missed opportunity for everybody because the environment, the world we live in today, it can be easy to not take that time. So yeah, it's a good reminder. That's the place to start. Deborah, we like to close out every episode with rapid round. It's yes, no, one word answers usually, but feel free to give more if you're like, this warrants more. So I'm going to give it to you. Are you ready for rapid round?
Yes, I'm excited.
Okay. Is it possible for every workplace to become trauma informed?
Yes, I do think it's possible because ultimately being trauma informed is just being more aware about your humanity and how you can connect to other humans in a way that is meaningful.
Yeah. You hear that, folks? Pay attention to humanity at work. Should trauma-informed care be a mandatory part of leadership training?
I wouldn't want to go as far as to say it's mandatory. One of the key tenets of trauma-informed care is choice. So I think ultimately people have to be able to opt into that. But I do think that if people understood the benefits of trauma-informed care and how it leads to a more cohesive and innovative workplace where people feel safe and it's more fun, it's more engaging, it's just a more positive environment to be in. And how can you get the most out of your time at work? You're going to spend like 40 to 80 hours of time at a place working on something. Don't you want it to be enjoyable? Don't you want it to be meaningful and engaging? So those are the key benefits of trauma-informed care. And then add to that productivity. And there you have your answer.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is it's a good high opt-in if you can do it.
Strongly encouraged.
Strongly encouraged. Strongly recommended.
I'm not saying it's required or mandatory, but...
Are leaders who practice embodied leadership more successful in retaining talent?
100%, yes.
Okay. And what is your go-to leadership practice to nurture embodied leadership?
So just now I mentioned reflection. So that's a key part of my life. Every morning when I wake up, I craft out some time for myself, half an hour to sometimes even an hour to spend time on just spiritual material, a devotional that I read. I'm big in my faith, so I spend time on doing things that feed my spirit, feed my soul. Music is a big part of that too. Writing, journaling, those are all practices that I keep so that I can in many ways stay sane in a world where like so many things are constantly vying for your attention and then you have to keep prioritizing things. That's definitely one thing that I would recommend to leaders. I think regular therapy, or like coaching sessions, that's also really helpful. And there's so many resources and tools out there, books you can read. It's really important to stay connected as a person. I'm an introvert, right? I can spend hours on end on my own, but it's actually not really healthy to isolate yourself for long periods of time because being around other people actually does help you in some ways to come back to yourself. After this podcast, I know I'm going to be energized to do other things. And that's been my experience, talking to people, having some conversations, having another part of my mind opened up. Like it gives me inspiration to do more. It gives me the impetus to move forward because that engagement itself gives me a sense of meaning and purpose.
We just so appreciate you joining us to talk about this.
I
great
really
topic.
Loved chatting with you guys, and I just love the vibe. You guys really keep it real, and that's really what's needed, especially when you talk about like corporate life, because oftentimes people feel like, oh, I can't say this or I can't do this, and it's just you're keeping it real, and I think it's so important.
Thanks. Hey, friends. This episode of Your Work Friends was hosted by Francesca Ranieri and myself, Mel Plett.
This episode was produced and edited by Mel Plett and myself, Francesca Ranieri.
Our theme music is by Pink Zebra. And you can follow us over on all of our social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and if you're so inclined, join us over on LinkedIn in our large and growing community. And you can email us at friend@yourworkfriends.com or visit us on yourworkfriends.com. Also, folks, please like, subscribe, and leave a review if you enjoyed this episode. And if you really enjoyed it, please share with a work friend or two.
Thanks, friends.